All right, hi everyone. Jumping into uh, the 10th chapter of First Corinthians. We're going to go from, well, it's listed as 10:1 to 11:1, but actually we're going to start back in verse 9:24. 9:24 to 9:27 serve as kind of like a hinge. Um, it seems to me that they do. They kind of have something to do with chapter 9 and also chapter 10. So Paul kind of uses it as a transition into what he's going to say. So let's start there. He has this warning to kind of run the race and be under control. Daryl just walked in. We're wearing the same shirt today. Check it out. Twinsies! Yeah. There you go. What are we talking about? To run the race, be under control. And then he goes into these examples. He's talking about Israelites and how they were. There's all this kind of confusing language. I've tried to guide you a little bit on the notes for that. He's talking about them going to the Red Sea, and then he has some things to say about manna and water from the rock, and it can all be a little bit confusing. And I have some notes that hopefully guide you through that. But the point is this, and I'm kind of spoiling where we're going. The Israelites had experienced all this richness of spiritual blessing. They had some pretty amazing things happen. They were provided for in these really miraculous ways. And yet, he's saying God was not pleased with them, for they were overthrown. So that kind of goes back. He's going to tell us that we need to run the race, right? We need to make sure we're not falling victim to whatever the Israelites fell victim of. So trying to block the glare on our screen here. So yeah, try to avoid the tangents here. I know there's a lot in this whole chapter, but do your best. And it's okay. So answering the second major bullet point there, it's surprising that they turned away and were disobedient from God because of all these things that happened. You would think, wow, they've experienced the Red Sea, the pillar of clouds and fire, and all these really miraculous things, the manna and the water from the rock, and yet, like, they turned away from God. So he goes on in verses 6 to 13 to say, these things serve as a warning for you, that you might not fall into the same kind of thinking, the same kind of trap that they did. So the question is, what exactly is that trap? And so I have you read some verses here in Exodus and Numbers. It's the stories that he's alluding to there in 7 to 10. And the basic idea is that things would go really well for the Israelites for a while, but every time something went poorly for them, or things were going just not how they imagined it, or things were bad, whatever it was, they started to doubt God, and they started to worship idols who they thought would maybe treat them better. So that's basically the mindset. It was when things weren't going bad, it was like, oh no, God has abandoned us. I'm going to take matters into my own hands here. We can relate to that probably, feeling disappointed in whatever's going on right now and starting to doubt God's big plan, either for our lives or for the world or whatever it is. And it's important to recognize that we too fall into that kind of trap, even though sometimes the Israelites feel a little bit foreign to us. So really, this is about temptation here, this first section. And so I'm asking you guys to consider, what are some ways that you typically try to avoid falling into temptation? And then I have some things to help you think through there. But there's a break at 13, sort of, but the argument continues. So you'll keep reading, and you'll go down to 14 to 22. And in 14 to 22, something really interesting is happening. Paul's using the Lord's Supper, and what the reality is that's happening in the Lord's Supper, to compare it to what the Israelites are doing. I'm answering the first question here. What is the issue? By participating in idol worship. So let me try to explain. Back in chapter 8, remember we said, oh, sure, we can eat meat sacrificed to idols because there's no gods, right? Well, it seems here that the people were actually going to worship to, I don't know, for lack of a better term, the services. There weren't services, but the instances of idol worship and idol sacrifice and participating in those kinds of things. Um, and Paul is saying, now we'll try to figure out why they're doing that in a minute. But Paul is saying, when you do this, you are engaging in fellowship with demons. That's what he's going to say. Just like in the Lord's Supper, it's this act of unity with the body of Christ and with other believers. When you eat or when you participate in this idol worship, you are doing the same thing with demons. And so he acknowledges in verse 19 that you could think, he's like, well, didn't you say that there's no such thing as idols? He's saying, yes, but there are demons, and they show up, and they are a real issue to be dealt with. And hopefully this will start to make sense why that's going on in just a minute. So let's get there together. We don't typically participate in the kind of idol worship that Paul is talking about here because it's not typically happening around us. However, what idolatry is to give all of your worship to something that is not God or someone that is not God. To worship something, it means to give it all of your attention and devotion, your life. And what happens is the thing that you worship will start to shape you. Whatever you worship will start to shape you. It'll control the way that you think, the things that you do, whatever. So whatever you worship, that is a thing that starts to shape your life and orient your life. So to start to understand what's going on here, first think about what things become our objects of worship, our objects of attention and devotion. And think about how that impacts us. Another piece of this puzzle is that idol worship had to do with wanting to take control of the events of your life by manipulating the gods. In ancient times, you would do these things for the gods, and they would do other things for you. So to try to tie it all together, what's going on is that there's a couple of things that are going on, but a part of it is there would be times in their lives when they would try to manipulate the gods, right? When they would try to, things weren't going well, right? Maybe that's going on for you. Something might not be going well for you. And subtly, we can slip into this mindset of like, okay, what do I need to do to get things back on track? And that could be some way you try to, manipulate God by saying like, well, if I pray more, if I act more holy, God maybe will bless me or something like that. Or you could try to take matters into your own hands, and you could just say like, okay, well, trusting God and this is not working out for me right now, so I'm going to do what I need to do to make my life work how I want it to work. And what's really tricky about this is that while we're not engaging in some like weird idol worship ritual kind of things, what I think we need to know is when we fall into that kind of thinking that I just described, we are falling into idolatrous thinking. And demons are present in that. Now, I don't know how much you think about demons, but I have you reading a passage from Ephesians 6, which is the armor of God. And the armor of God begins with this statement that the battle that we have is not against flesh and blood, but it's against powers and principalities. I forget exactly what it says, but it's against demons. There's a spiritual battle happening around us that we're often not aware of. And what I want you to consider is that as you read the armor of God and the things that it tells you, like the fight with truth and righteousness and whatnot, you can see the enemy in the antithesis of those things. So if the armor of God involves truth, then the enemy brings lies. Does that make sense? So the armor of God can teach us about the devil's schemes. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Here's the last piece I hope will tie it together. the Corinthians seem to have fallen into this idol worship. Remember, I said before, like, well, why are they doing this? Because they had become presumptuous. Okay. They were participating in idols like the Lord's Supper. They were good Christian folks. That's what I'm trying to say. They liked to do the Christian things. They had seen God at work. And so they became kind of blasé about stuff that was either spiritually neutral, and in their case, what Paul was saying, spiritually not neutral. Now, I don't know why each individual was engaging in idol worship, but they seem to have become presumptuous. And I know that because of what he said, the examples he used of the Israelites. They had all these like spiritual blessings, and yet here they are turning away. So I'm asking you to consider, what are some things that can lead you to spiritual arrogance? Because those things, once you become spiritually arrogant or spiritually prideful, you begin to fall into idolatry. That's what happens. The external things upon which you're judging your arrogance or determining your source of spiritual pride will not hold up in spiritual reality. It's your inward reality. It's your humility before the Lord that will keep you from temptation. So what I'm closing this little section with is if you go back to the Israelites and their tumultuous relationship with God, one thing that God frequently said is something along the lines of, don't forget, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, who brought you out of slavery. And that's what we need to remember as well. We need to remember that God has saved us and rescued us outside of ourselves. And that is critical to us fighting temptation and to avoiding spiritual arrogance. Okay, pause for a minute and say, all that is a huge web of stuff that I just said. There's a lot there, and I struggled to try to make sense of it and try to communicate it. Please let me know if you have questions about all that. I know that a lot of what I said might be complicated and confusing, so please feel free to ask. To wrap up this section, you have 10:23 to 11:1, and Paul is putting a bow on this section here that he began in chapter 8. He's going to repeat some stuff, so I don't go into it again, or repeat it or say something very similar. But do read it, and if any conversation comes, go for it. But generally, the outlook and posture of his life is outward. He's saying, that famous verse in 31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it for the glory of God. And what he's saying is that to do things for the glory of God is to do them in such a way that other people can come to know and see Christ. So as we think, like, how can I glorify God with my life? You're thinking, how can I live in such a way that I'm others-centered, that my life is about others? And there's two things to think about. You can think about the people that you know that do that well, that imitate Christ well. Or you can think about Christ himself, of course. Both seem to be leaders of me as I am of Christ. If you have time, Philippians 2 is a good example there. Christ, of course, very other focused as he comes down to earth and lays down his life for us. So that's how this section ends. And in the next chapters, we go into some specific issues like head coverings and the Lord's Supper and all kinds of spiritual gifts, all kinds of fun things. So that's that. Hope it makes sense. My challenge this week, I went a little more simple, something that maybe doesn't involve like a specific action, but more of like a mindset for them this week. And for you, throughout the week, consider how you can better glorify God with your life. Meaning, how, as you go through your life, think about how you can be more geared towards or oriented towards others coming to know and see Christ in you. What could be different about your life to that end? So, okay. Ooh, that's a big one. This chapter was tough. I hope there's a lot you could talk about, a lot of directions you could go, but this is a good starting point. Okay, talk to you later.